Hello, friends. I'm Jonathan Pishner with Apex Counseling, and today I want to address a question that I get asked sometimes, especially by people who've never been to therapy. Because if you've never been, sometimes it's kind of a mysterious process because we're not really allowed or able to, show the behind the scenes very often or easily because it's such a confidential process. So, uh, anytime we get to show what therapy's like, oftentimes it's a little staged and people can't be sure of exactly how real what they're seeing is. So, I wanted to talk about one of the big questions I get whenever somebody asks me about therapy or therapists in general or the process, which is, will therapists actually give me advice on how to change things? And the answer is pretty individual across therapists. But there are some generalities that I can talk about, and I can talk about the way I think through whether or not I decide to give advice or not. So, broad stroke, there's a lot of therapists out there who flatly refuse to give advice at all. And there's a reason for that. I'm not sure if the reasoning is always good, but the reason for that is that um, by giving advice, you're derailing a person's thought process in the sense of like helping them think through the problem. So there is something to be said for the therapist to choose not to give advice ever at all and continually reflect the question back to the client. So, and in a way, this is parodied to death in certain ways in pop culture. You'll see on a television show, clients say, "What should I do?" And the therapist turn around and say, "Well, what do you think you should do?" Hopefully, it's not quite that bad in a therapy session, but there is a reason why we would choose not to give advice. Now, I'm kind of split. I'll give advice sometimes, and sometimes I'll not, depending on what my goal is for the therapy session, and what my client's goal is for the therapy session. Because sometimes people come in and the answer is obvious, they just can't see it. So, uh, as as, as obvious as it might sound, I have sometimes had clients come in where the love relationship is going badly, and it turns out the thing they need to do is actually treat their partner nicely, which sounds obvious, but certain ways life goes, it can become non-obvious. And in those moments, if I decide to play the don't give advice game, but make them think through it game, there's something to that. But if a person's in a certain amount of pain, helping them to get out of that pain first and then learn to think through problems later is usually the way I prefer to go with things. So, um, there's this saying in our culture in America: give a man a fish, you feed him for a day; teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Well, if somebody's starving to death, it doesn't make sense to try and teach them how to fish. Feed them first. Then, when they have a full belly, then we can learn how to fish. So I prefer to take that approach because if if a person's in too much pain, they can't think through things properly. Almost everyone watching this will have been through some point in your life where even just sending a text message was such a monumental task because you were in so much pain over something else that tiny things become difficult. So, my preferred approach is split. Sometimes give advice, but then once that's done, help a client access their internal resources and start to think through things. You can go overboard on the other side too. There's plenty of therapists who just give advice, and sometimes that can be okay, but then you are in fact robbing a person of the opportunity to start to learn to think through things themselves. Not every one of my clients, once they get well, fires me. Some of them stay on a maintenance routine, but one of my main goals in therapy is to put my clients in a position where if they wanted to fire me, they'd be perfectly fine. I don't want to accidentally create a situation where they need me to give them information to handle every decision. So, in my own personal opinion on how therapy should be conducted, I think it should be both. I think a therapist should give a fair bit of advice, when that's the right move and when the client has real difficulty accessing their own internal resources. But after a certain point, I definitely think I should be moving to let me help you think through this so you can craft your own advice so that one day, if you decide you don't want to engage in a therapy process anymore, exiting it won't be in any way harmful because you'll already know how to think through things. So, uh, I realize I kind of changed the question and asked and answered a different question because how much advice do therapists give? It's just too individual for me to answer. But the way I think through what therapists should do, and when I train therapists to decide when to give advice, how I do it is if a person's in too much pain to come up with their own advice, give advice to the extent that that's appropriate. There's some questions that are just too big, like, should I get divorced? That's a bit too big and a bit too individual. We have to find other ways to get a person out of pain to help them think through that on their own. But some things are simple enough we can give advice on. So when that's available, yes, give advice. Once a person's accessed enough resources, then help them figure out how to make their own decisions and craft their own advice. So for anyone who was wondering, that's how a lot of the therapists I like to hang out with think through it. That's how I personally think through it. And hopefully this was helpful to somebody out there today. My name is Jonathan Pishner with Apex Counseling, and I will see you next time.